The rain fell in gray, relentless sheets, blurring the neon sign of Sal's place into a smear of pink and blue against the bruised twilight sky. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, sizzling grease, and unspoken misery. Clara moved through it like a ghost, her feet silent on the checkered linoleum floor. Each step was a careful negotiation with the weariness that had settled deep in her bones. She refilled a trucker's coffee mug, her smile a fragile, practiced thing that didn't reach the hollows of her eyes. She felt the stares of the few patrons, a family with 2 small children huddled in a booth, 2 long-haul truckers hunched over the counter, and knew what they saw: a girl who looked like she was perpetually waiting for the other shoe to drop. They were right. The bell above the door chimed, a tinny, cheerful sound that was a lie. Rick strode in, bringing with him the cold, damp air and an aura of entitlement that sucked the remaining warmth from the room. He shook the rain from his leather jacket, spattering the freshly mopped floor. Clara flinched, her shoulders tightening. He scanned the diner, his eyes landing on her with a possessive glare that felt like a physical touch. "Clara," he said, his voice too loud for the quiet space. "Wipe this table down. It's filthy." He pointed to a perfectly clean booth. The family in the adjacent booth fell silent, the father's hand hovering protectively over his son's shoulder. Clara grabbed a damp cloth from beneath the counter, the familiar knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "Hi, Rick," she murmured, keeping her eyes downcast. She could feel him watching her every move as she wiped the Formica tabletop in slow, circular motions. He wasn't here for a meal. He was here for a performance, and she was the main act. "Look at you," he sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Still slinging hash in this dump. I thought you had ambition." His words were hooks, designed to snag on her insecurities and pull. The truckers shifted uncomfortably on their stools, their gazes fixed on the swirling coffee in their mugs. In a dark corner booth, for men sat in shadow, their forms massive and still. They were clad in worn leather vests adorned with the snarling emblem of the Hells Angels. They hadn't spoken a word since they arrived an hour ago, just nursed their black coffees, their presence a low hum of potential energy in the otherwise listless room. One of them, a man with a beard like iron filings and eyes that seemed to miss nothing, watched Rick's entrance without expression, his heavy, ringed fingers resting motionless on his mug. He saw the girl's flinch, the forced subservience, the way her light seemed to dim the moment the man walked in. He saw the predator and the prey, a story as old as the cracked asphalt on the highway outside. Rick slid into the booth Clara had just cleaned, swinging his legs up onto the vinyl seat. He tracked mud onto the pristine surface. "Get me a beer," he commanded, snapping his fingers. "We don't serve beer, Rick." "You know that," Clara said softly, her voice barely a whisper. She stood by the table, the damp rag clutched in her hand, a useless shield. "Then what good are you?" he shot back, his voice dripping with contempt. He reached out and snagged her apron, pulling her closer. His fingers dug into the fabric, pressing against her hip. "You've been holding out on me." I know you have. His eyes, small and hard, searched her face for the fear he fed on. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The tips. He was here for her tips. The meager collection of crumpled bills and coins she kept in her apron pocket was all she had to show for a 10-hour shift. It was meant for rent, for the groceries she would buy on the way home, for the impossible dream of a bus ticket to anywhere else. The diner's owner, Sal, a man whose spine had been worn down by years of appeasing difficult customers, emerged from the kitchen. He wiped his hands on his greasy apron, his gaze darting nervously between Rick and Clara. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his voice thin and reedy. "Everything's fine, Sal," Rick said, not taking his eyes off Clara. "Just having a conversation with my girl." The word "my" was a brand, staking a claim that made Clara's skin crawl. Sal wrung his hands. "Well, keep it down, Rick. You're bothering the other customers." It was a plea, not a command. The family in the booth was trying to become invisible, the mother whispering to her children, urging them to finish their fries. The truckers stared resolutely forward, creating a wall of silent indifference. Their silence was an accomplice, a verdict that her humiliation was her problem alone. Clara felt a familiar wave of shame wash over her, hot and suffocating. It wasn't just Rick's cruelty that hurt. It was the quiet consensus of the room that she deserved it, or at the very least, that her suffering wasn't worth interrupting their meal for. She was just another piece of the dreary scenery, a part of the background noise. Her worth was being denied not just by one man, but by a roomful of strangers who chose to look away. He yanked her apron again, harder this time. "The money, Clara." His voice dropped to a venomous hiss. Now the man in the corner booth, the one with the iron-filing beard, slowly lifted his coffee mug to his lips. His eyes, however, never left the scene. They were glacial, ancient, and they were taking measure. He noted the slight tremor in the girl's hand, the rigid set of her jaw, the flicker of defiance that burned like a pilot light in the depths of her fear. He saw the owner's cowardice and the patron's apathy. And he waited. Clara's mind retreated to a safer place, a small, sunlit kitchen from a lifetime ago. She could almost smell the cinnamon and yeast of her mother's baking, could feel the warmth of the oven on her face. Her mother, a woman who faced the world with a quiet, unyielding grace, had always told her, "Strength isn't about how loud you shout, little bird. It's about how long you can hold on when everyone else lets go." That memory was a small, smooth stone she carried in the pocket of her soul. She had held on for so long. She'd left her small hometown after her mother passed, escaping the pitying looks and the suffocating quiet of a house filled with ghosts. She had drifted here, to this forgotten town on the edge of nowhere, hoping for a fresh start. Rick had seemed like a fresh start. He'd been charming then, full of easy smiles and grand promises. He'd made her feel seen when she felt invisible. But the charm had curdled into control, the promises into prisons. He'd systematically dismantled her world, isolating her from the few friends she'd made, convincing her that his jealousy was a form of love, that his anger was her fault. The diner became her only refuge, a place where she could earn her own money, a place that was hers, however dingy and insignificant. The wad of cash in her apron was more than just money. It was a testament to her resilience. It was hours of aching feet, of smiling through exhaustion, of cleaning up other people's messes. Every dollar was a brick in the wall she was building around herself, a wall she hoped would one day be high enough to climb over and run. She had a small, worn shoebox hidden under a loose floorboard in her tiny apartment. Inside was nearly $300, saved one crumpled bill at a time. It was her escape fund, her ticket to a life where she didn't have to measure her words or shrink herself to avoid setting off a storm. She thought of her father, a man she barely remembered, a Marine whose life was a collection of faded photographs and stories her mother told. He was a hero, they said. He had died in a place far from home, fighting for something he believed in. On her wrist, hidden most days by the sleeve of her uniform, was a small, faded tattoo of his unit's insignia, a fierce eagle clutching an anchor. It was a foolish, youthful tribute she'd gotten on her 18th birthday, a permanent reminder of a legacy of courage she felt she could never live up to. He had been brave. She was just surviving. But her mother's words echoed in her mind. Hold on. And so she did. She held onto the counter, held onto her breath, held onto the small, flickering ember of defiance that Rick was trying so desperately to extinguish. She had held on through his taunts, his threats, his suffocating presence. She would hold on now. The fragile tension in the diner was stretched to its breaking point. Rick's patience, always a shallow commodity, had run out. His face, already flushed with anger, darkened to a dangerous shade of crimson. "I saw the bank envelope in your pocket this morning, Clara," he snarled, his voice a low growl that vibrated with menace. "Don't lie to me. You've been saving. Hiding my money. It wasn't his money. It was hers, earned by her. But in his world, everything was his. She was his. Her labor was his. Her money was his. It's for the rent, Rick," she said, her voice shaking but steady. She would not give it to him. Not this time. That small act of defiance was like a lit match tossed on gasoline. With a roar of fury, he swept his arm across the table. The salt and pepper shakers, the sugar dispenser, and a glass of ice water went flying. The glass hit the floor and shattered, the sound like a gunshot in the stunned silence. The little girl in the family booth whimpered, burying her face in her mother's side. Sal jumped back behind the counter as if he'd been shocked. The truckers finally turned on their stools, their faces grim. This had crossed a line from a private argument into a public spectacle of violence. "You think you can play me for a fool?" Rick bellowed, rising to his feet, his shadow falling over Clara. He was bigger than her, stronger, and he was cornering her against the counter. She had nowhere to run. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She could feel the collective gaze of the room on her, a weight of expectation and fear. They were still silent, still watching, a passive audience to her imminent destruction. The bikers in the corner had not moved, but the air around their table had grown thick and cold. The leader's eyes were narrowed, his jaw set like granite. He was no longer just observing, he was judging. He watched the girl, saw the terror in her eyes, but also the unbroken line of her spine. She was afraid, but she was not broken. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of young recruits facing their first taste of combat, in men who had lost everything but their honor. It was the look of someone who had decided where they would make their stand. Clara braced herself. She could smell the stale beer on his breath, see the wild, irrational rage in his eyes. He was going to hit her, here, in front of everyone, and no one would do a thing. The thought was strangely liberating. If this was her line in the sand, she would not be erased from it cowering. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting his for the first time, a silent declaration of war. As Rick's hand drew back, coiling like a snake ready to strike, a small, choked sob cut through the tense air. Everyone's attention, for a split second, flickered to the family booth. The little girl, no older than 5, had dropped her well-loved teddy bear. It had bounced from the vinyl seat and rolled to a stop on the grimy floor, landing directly between Rick's muddy boots. Her small face crumpled, tears welling in her big, brown eyes. "Bunny," she cried, her tiny voice filled with more genuine heartbreak than all the adult drama in the room. In that instant, something shifted inside Clara. The primal, instinctual wiring of a protector fired, overriding her own fear. The world narrowed to that small, crying child and the lost stuffed animal. Her terror for herself was eclipsed by an overwhelming need to shield that little girl's innocence from the ugliness that was about to unfold. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think. She acted. She moved with a fluid grace that surprised everyone, including herself. She darted forward, not away from Rick, but towards him, placing her body between his impending violence and the child's line of sight. She knelt down on the floor, her knees pressing into the cold, sticky linoleum amidst the shards of broken glass. Her focus was entirely on the task at hand. She ignored Rick, who stood frozen above her, his hand still raised in a fist of aborted rage. She ignored the shocked stares of the other patrons. Her world consisted only of the lost bear. With a hand that was surprisingly steady, she picked up the stuffed animal. It was worn and matted, one of its button eyes loose, but she held it as if it were the most precious object in the world. She brushed a piece of glass from its fur and then looked up at the little girl. The smile she offered was genuine, radiant, a beacon of pure kindness in the suffocating darkness of the diner. It was a smile that promised safety, that said, "It's okay. The world is not as scary as it seems right now." She held out the bear. "Here you go, sweetie," she said, her voice soft and clear. Bunny is safe. The little girl, her tears momentarily forgotten, reached out a chubby hand and took her beloved toy, clutching it to her chest. She gave Clara a watery, grateful smile. It was a selfless, simple act of profound decency. In the middle of her own nightmare, facing down her tormentor, Clara's first instinct had been to comfort a child. She had chosen compassion over self-preservation, a sacrifice of her own safety for the sake of a stranger's peace of mind. And in that single beautiful moment, the entire dynamic of the room was forever altered. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer the silence of apathy or fear, but one of stunned, dawning realization. The air, once charged with menace, now hummed with a new and unfamiliar current. Respect. The little girl's mother, who had been trying to shrink into the booth's upholstery, now stared at Clara with wide, tear-filled eyes. She saw not a pathetic victim, but a guardian angel in a cheap waitress uniform. She pulled her daughter close, her protective gesture now mirrored by a deep sense of gratitude towards the young woman on the floor. At the counter, the two truckers slowly lowered their coffee mugs. Their expressions, previously masked and non-committal, had hardened into a quiet fury directed squarely at Rick. One of them, a burly man with a faded flag tattoo on his forearm, placed his hands flat on the counter, his knuckles white. He was done being a spectator. Sal, the owner, took a hesitant step out from behind the counter, a meat cleaver suddenly seeming to appear in his hand as he began to chop onions with a newfound, aggressive purpose. Whispers, like the first drops of a coming storm, began to circulate. "Did you see that?" the woman in the booth murmured to her husband. "He was going to hit her, and she couldn't finish the sentence, her voice thick with emotion. The husband nodded, his jaw tight, his gaze locked on Rick with open hostility. The collective judgment of the room had pivoted. Clara was no longer the source of an uncomfortable scene to be ignored. She was the heroine of a story they had all just witnessed. The shame that had been forced upon her was now transferred, a heavy cloak settling onto Rick's shoulders. He stood there, his fist still half raised, looking utterly bewildered. His power, which fed on her fear and the complicity of others, had vanished. He had been rendered impotent by a simple act of kindness. He tried to reclaim his dominance, sputtering, "What do you think you're doing?" But his voice lacked its earlier conviction. It was hollow, pathetic. Clara rose slowly to her feet, her movements deliberate and graceful. She did not look at Rick. She looked at the little girl, who was now hugging her teddy bear tightly, her fears assuaged. Clara's quiet dignity was a shield more powerful than any physical defense. She had not fought back with fists or with words, but with her character. And she had won. The bikers in the corner booth remained motionless, but the shift had not gone unnoticed. The leader's eyes held a new light. It was the look of a man who had just witnessed something rare and true. He had seen countless bar fights, displays of brutish strength and hollow machismo. But this was different. This was strength of a higher order. He slowly, deliberately, placed his coffee mug back on the table. The soft click of ceramic on formica was the only sound, a punctuation mark at the end of a chapter, and the signal that a new one was about to begin. The scrape of the chair on the linoleum floor was like a crack of thunder. It was a sound that commanded attention, sharp and decisive, cutting through the murmuring whispers. Sledge, the president of the local Hells Angels charter, rose to his full, imposing height. He was a mountain of a man, carved from oak and weathered by 1,000 miles of hard road. His leather cut was a tapestry of his life. Patches for fallen brothers, road names, and the terrifying, iconic death's head emblem that promised a world of trouble to those who crossed its path. As he stood, his 3 brothers rose with him in silent, fluid unison. They were cut from the same cloth. Big men with hard faces, long beards, and the kind of quiet intensity that was far more intimidating than any loud threat. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They moved away from their booth, their heavy boots thudding on the floor with grim purpose. They formed a living wall, a phalanx of worn leather and hardened muscle, positioning themselves between Rick and Clara. The space they occupied was absolute, a non-negotiable border that Rick could not cross. The air crackled with a sudden, palpable danger. The smell of old leather, engine oil, and rain-soaked denim filled the space, a primal scent of power. Rick, who had seemed so large and menacing just moments before, now looked small and insignificant, a yapping dog facing a pack of wolves. He took an involuntary step back, his blustering rage deflating into visible fear. "Hey, man, this ain't your business," he stammered, holding up his hands in a weak, placating gesture. Sledge didn't even look at him. His gaze was fixed on a point just over Rick's head, as if he were an annoying insect not worthy of direct acknowledgement. The other bikers flanked him, their arms crossed over their broad chests, their expressions unreadable masks of stone. Just then, a low rumble began to permeate the diner walls. It started as a distant vibration, a tremor you felt in the soles of your feet before you heard it. The rumble grew steadily, deepening into a guttural roar that vibrated the windows in their frames and rattled the coffee cups on the tables. One by one, headlights cut through the gloom of the rainy evening, sweeping across the diner's interior. A motorcycle pulled into the lot, then another, and another. Soon, the entire parking lot was a sea of chrome and steel, a dozen, then 2 dozen, then more bikes, their engines idling in a thunderous synchronized chorus. Members of the club, summoned by a silent text message sent moments before, had arrived. They dismounted, a legion of leather-clad giants, and surrounded the small diner, their presence a silent, overwhelming siege. They didn't try to come in. They just stood outside in the rain, their forms silhouetted by their own headlights, watching, waiting. The message was unequivocal. This diner and everyone in it was now under their protection. Rick was trapped. The intimidating wall of bikers inside and the silent army outside had completely dismantled his courage. He was pale, sweating, his eyes darting around for an escape that didn't exist. Sledge finally lowered his gaze, his eyes like chips of flint, and pinned Rick with a look of pure, cold dismissal. "Respect?" Sledge said, his voice a low gravel that seemed to rise from the very earth. "Is always our business," the words hung in the air, a final judgment. He then turned his attention away from Rick, as if he no longer mattered, and looked towards the counter. "Sal," he rumbled. "This girl. She a good worker." Sal, emboldened by the sudden and overwhelming shift in power, stepped forward. The fear had been washed out of him, replaced by a righteous indignation he hadn't felt in years. "Good worker," Sal scoffed, slamming the meat cleaver into his cutting board for emphasis. "She's the best I've ever had. Works doubles 3 times a week, never complains. Last week, she saw Mrs. Gable from down the street couldn't afford all her groceries. So Clara paid the difference out of her own tips. Didn't say a word to anyone. I only know because Mrs. Gable told me." The trucker with the flag tattoo spoke up from his stool, his voice a deep baritone. "Seen her do it myself. Last winter, a family's car broke down out front. They had 3 kids, no money for a tow. She bought them all dinner, sat with the kids and drew pictures on napkins to keep them calm until the tow truck came. A new picture of Clara was being painted for the room, one of quiet, consistent compassion. She wasn't a victim. She was a pillar of strength in her own small world, offering kindness to anyone who needed it. Clara flushed and used to being the center of such attention. She stood quietly, twisting the hem of her apron. As she did, her sleeve rode up, revealing the small, faded tattoo on her wrist, the eagle and the anchor of the United States Marine Corps. Sledge's sharp eyes caught the insignia. His expression, which had been hard and unyielding, softened almost imperceptibly. He took a step closer to her, his massive frame looming over her, but there was no menace in it now, only a quiet intensity. He gently took her arm, his callous thumb brushing over the faded ink. "Where'd you get this?" he asked, his voice softer than anyone in the room had ever heard it. "It was my father's," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He was in the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. He didn't come home." Sledge's gaze met hers, and in his eyes, she saw a universe of shared understanding. He nodded slowly, a deep, profound respect dawning on his face. He released her arm and touched the patch on his own vest, a patch that read Semper Fi. "He was a brother," Sledge said, his voice resonating with the weight of that sacred word. The revelation hung in the air. She was not just a waitress. She was the daughter of a fallen hero, a legacy of the very brotherhood of sacrifice and honor that these men, in their own way, lived by. The bond was forged. The connection was absolute. In Sledge's world, there was no higher calling than loyalty to the brotherhood, and that loyalty extended to the families of the fallen. Clara was no longer a stranger. She was family. He turned his head slightly, giving a curt nod to two of his men. They understood immediately. Without a word, they each took one of Rick's arms in an iron grip. Rick's face went slack with terror. "No, wait. Please," he whimpered. His bravado completely evaporated. "I'm sorry, all right? I'll leave. You'll leave." Sledge agreed, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The two bikers began to march Rick towards the door. They didn't punch him. They didn't kick him. Their punishment was far more profound. They subjected him to the ultimate humiliation, a walk of shame. As they pushed him through the diner door, the 30 or more bikers gathered outside parted silently, forming a long, intimidating gauntlet that led from the diner's entrance to Rick's car at the far end of the lot. They stared at him, their faces impassive, their silence a crushing weight of judgment. He was forced to walk that long path, each step a testament to his cowardice, his weakness exposed under the collective, contemptuous gaze of men who embodied a code of honor he could never comprehend. He stumbled, fell to his knees in a puddle, and scrambled back up, covered in mud, never once looking back. He fumbled with his keys, finally got his car started, and peeled out of the parking lot, his tires squealing in a final, pathetic display. He was gone. The threat was neutralized. Inside the diner, Sledge turned back to Clara. She stood trembling, a mixture of shock, relief, and overwhelming gratitude washing over her. He moved towards her, and with a surprising gentleness, he began to unbuckle his own vest. The cut was a sacred object in biker culture, a symbol of identity, loyalty, and years of dedication. It was earned, not given. He shrugged the heavy leather from his massive shoulders and, in a gesture of profound respect, he draped it over Clara's small frame. It engulfed her, the worn leather heavy and smelling of the open road. On the back, the club's death's head emblem now served as her shield. "No one," Sledge said, his voice a solemn vow that echoed in the quiet room, "touches family." The other bikers inside nodded their silent, grim approval. One of them walked over to the counter and dropped a thick roll of bills in front of Sal. "For the damages," he grunted. "And for her," he gestured towards Clara. "Whatever she needs." The family in the booth, their meal long forgotten, stood up. The father walked over to Clara, his eyes full of admiration. He reached into his wallet and placed a crisp $100 bill on the counter next to the biker's money. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with sincerity. "You showed my kids what real courage looks like tonight." The community, once silent and complicit, was now offering its own form of recognition, a tribute to the quiet strength they had failed to see until it was illuminated by an act of selfless courage. The army of bikers outside dispersed from their sentinel positions, their duty done. A half-dozen of them came inside, filling the diner with their large frames and quiet presence. The atmosphere had been transformed. The space that had so recently been a theater of humiliation was now a sanctuary, a fortress. The bikers took up booths and stools at the counter, their intimidating appearances belying their respectful demeanor. They ordered coffee and slices of apple pie, their deep voices rumbling with quiet conversation. Their presence was a promise, a living, breathing shield around Clara. She, in turn, began to move with a newfound confidence. The weight of the leather vest on her shoulders was not a burden. It was an anchor. It was a physical manifestation of the belonging and safety she had craved for so long. She picked up a fresh coffee pot, the weariness in her limbs replaced by a steady, humming energy. She moved from table to table, refilling their mugs, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. She was no longer just a waitress serving customers. She was a daughter of the brotherhood, caring for her protectors. She shared quiet words with them, answering their gruff but gentle questions about her father, about her life. They listened with a focused intensity, absorbing her story, making it a part of their own collective history. The truckers at the counter, who had finished their meals long ago, made no move to leave. They simply sat, nursing their coffees, content to bear witness to the quiet miracle that had unfolded. Sal worked the grill, flipping burgers for the bikers, a lightness in his step that hadn't been there in years. He felt like the proprietor of the most important establishment in the world tonight. As the hours passed and the last of the rain clouds drifted away, a pale moon emerged, casting a silvery glow over the wet asphalt of the parking lot. The bikers began to stir, their time at the diner drawing to a close. They paid their tabs, leaving tips that were extravagant enough to fund Clara's escape 10 times over. But she no longer felt the desperate need to run. Sledge was the last to leave. He stood before her at the door, the moonlight catching the silver in his beard. "We'll be around," he said. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. "This is a quiet town. We like it that way." He placed a heavy, paternal hand on her shoulder for a moment, a final gesture of solidarity. Then he turned and walked out to his bike, the engine roaring to life with a deafening blast that was a song of freedom and power. One by one, the motorcycles departed, their taillights a string of red jewels receding into the darkness. The thunder of their engines rolled across the landscape, a sound that would no longer inspire fear in this town, but a sense of security. Clara stood in the doorway, the cool night air on her face, still wrapped in the heavy leather vest. She watched until the very last light vanished over the horizon and the sound faded into the whisper of the wind. The diner was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was peaceful, settled. The patrons who remained, the truckers, the family, Sal, looked at her with a profound and enduring respect. She was no longer the invisible girl, the victim. She was Clara, the daughter of a Marine, a woman of quiet courage, a protected member of the most unlikely family imaginable. She belonged, and as she finally turned to lock the door for the night, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she would never feel alone again.